Climate Change International Legal Regime. The Kyoto Protocol. Lesson 1. Negotiations and Mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol. Learning Objectives. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to describe the main negotiation steps and the required conditions that allowed the entry into force of the Kyoto Protocol. Identify and describe the commitments, targets, and the proposed indicative measures set out in the protocol. Identify and describe the flexible mechanisms. Explain and list the requirements to be eligible for each of the flexible mechanisms. Negotiations. Kyoto Protocol, the negotiations. Let's click on each icon and discover the negotiations steps. 1995. COP1, Berlin, 1995. The parties to the 1992 UNFCCC recognized that in light of further scientific evidence, most prominently the second assessment report released by the IPCC, the commitments in the convention were not adequate to achieve its goal. The outcome of this COP provided a strong political mandate, the Berlin Mandate, for strengthening the commitments of developed country parties and other parties included in Annex, and without introducing any new commitments for non-Annex I parties. 1997. COP3 Kyoto 1997. The Berlin Mandate led to the adoption of the text of the Kyoto Protocol to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, 1997 Kyoto Protocol, at the COP3 in Kyoto in December 1997. 1998. COP4 Buenos Aires 1998. Although agreement was reached on the specific terms of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, many crucial technical and political issues were left unresolved, including, for example, operational rules, emission trading and the use of sinks. Most countries felt they could not ratify the 1997 Kyoto Protocol until these issues were settled. After further negotiations, the Buenos Aires Plan of Action was adopted at COP4 in 1998. This plan set out a program of work on the 1997 Kyoto Protocol operational rules, which was scheduled for finalization in 2000. 2000. COP6, The Hague. The outstanding issues continued to prove highly controversial, and negotiations eventually broke down at COP6 in The Hague. 2001. Bonn Agreements. In 2001, President Bush officially announced that the United States, the world's largest emitter of CO2, would not ratify the 1997 Kyoto Protocol on the basis that it would be detrimental to the country's economy and did not include binding emission reductions for developing countries. Despite this, the negotiation process was resumed and culminated in 2001 with the achievement of political agreement in the Bonn Agreements, which allowed completion of the Marrakesh Accords later that year. 2001. The Marrakesh Accords contain extensive and complex provisions to guide the practical implementation of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. These provisions cover the reporting and review process, the accounting rules, flexible mechanisms, the establishment of a compliance mechanism, and the elaboration of rules on permissible land use change, and forestry, LULUCF. The Marrakesh Accords also consolidate matters under the Convention relating to funding arrangements and capacity building for developing countries. 2004. The ratification of Russian Federation was deposited on the 18th of November 2004. 2005. In accordance with its Article 25, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol entered into force on the 90th day after the date that two conditions were fulfilled. 1. Sufficient Annex I countries to account for at least 55% of the total CO2 emissions from Annex I countries in 1990 ratified the protocol. 2. 55 countries ratified the protocol. The ratification of Russian Federation triggered entry into force of the protocol on 16th February 2005. The Kyoto Protocol entered into force on the 16th of February 2005, in December 1997, the 18th of November 2014. Well, we've just learned that it was the 16th of February 2005. That's correct. The ratification of Russian Federation deposited on 18th of November 2004 triggered entry into force of the protocol on 16th of February 2005. As intended by the Berlin Mandate, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol covers the period beyond the year 2000 and requires stronger commitments from Annex I parties to achieve quantified emission reductions within a specific timeframe. Let's click on the tabs and discover Annex A and Annex B commitments. Annex A. What are the 6 greenhouse gases listed in Annex A? Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride. These commitments cover the 6 greenhouse gases listed in Annex A of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and each Annex I party's particular quantified emission reduction target is listed in Annex B. Let's look at Annex B. Annex B parties' targets. These targets are designed to ensure that combined emissions from these Annex B parties are reduced to at least 5% below 1990 levels between 2008 and 2012. However, since emission levels have risen substantially since 1990, this measure is still unlikely to stabilize human-induced global warming. Commitments. Annex B parties' targets. In accordance with Article 4, (2) of the Convention, differentiated targets were set for Annex B parties taking into account their particular circumstances, including, for example, their ability to access clean technology. The differentiated emission reduction targets were based on 1990 emission levels and range from an 8% reduction for the EU to a 10% increase for Iceland, called assigned amounts. Changes in land use or forest plantations which result in emission reductions can also be used in principle to meet a party's emission reduction target, provided such changes do result in a real reduction. The sinks must become permanent. Emissions of greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide are converted to carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by using global warming potential factors established by the IPCC. Annex B parties' targets. All Annex B parties are obliged to make demonstrable progress in meeting their emission reduction targets by 2005. However, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol does not actually prescribe how the targets are to be achieved. Instead, a range of indicative measures are proposed, such as promoting energy efficiency, promoting renewable energy, phasing out subsidies that contravene the objectives of the Convention, protecting and enhancing sinks, promoting sustainable forms of agriculture. Under Article 4 of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, 2 or more Annex B parties can jointly fulfill their commitments by aggregating their emissions. As long as the total amount of emissions is within the total assigned amount limits of those parties as a group, it does not matter that some members have exceeded their individual limits. Under Article 4 of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, 2 or more Annex B parties can jointly fulfill their commitments by aggregating their emissions. As long as the total amount of emissions is within the total assigned amount limits of those parties as a group, it does not matter that some members have exceeded their individual limits. Flexible mechanisms. To facilitate implementation of the commitments described before, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol provides for the use of an innovative set of tools called the flexible mechanisms, designed to help the Annex I parties maximize the cost efficiency of meeting their emission reduction targets. Let's click on each question. Who? These flexible mechanisms allow state parties and authorized private or public organizations. What is the goal? To reduce emissions. How? By undertaking projects in other countries or by trading in emission reduction credits and then counting these reductions towards their own emission reduction targets. What are the conditions? The use of the flexible mechanisms is subject to the condition that the emission reductions achieved are supplemental to national action to reduce emissions. The 1997 Kyoto Protocol establishes 3 flexible mechanisms. Let's click on the tabs. Joint Implementation, JI. Joint implementation, as outlined in Article 6, provides that one Annex I party can receive credits for supporting and therefore jointly implementing appropriate projects to reduce emissions in another Annex I party. Such projects result in the generation of emission reduction units, ERUs, which can be used by the first Annex party to meet its own 1997 Kyoto Protocol target. The Clean Development Mechanism, CDM. The Clean Development Mechanism is designed to encourage emission reduction projects that assist in achieving sustainable development in developing countries. Using this mechanism, an Annex I party can support the implementation of eligible projects in non-Annex I parties, leading to the generation of certified emission reductions, CERs. The CDM, established under Article 12 of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, is the only flexible mechanism open to participation by developing countries. Under CDM, emission reduction projects in developing countries can earn certified emission reduction credits. These saleable credits can be used by developed countries to meet a part of their emissions reduction targets under the Kyoto Protocol. Eligibility. To participate in the Clean Development Mechanism, a host country must have ratified the 1997 Kyoto Protocol and set up a designated national authority to oversee the approval of the project. This national authority must decide whether a CDM project activity contributes to sustainable development in the host country, and whether the participants have voluntarily agreed to be involved in the project. Projects. For the certified emission reductions to be valid, the project's funding must be in addition to existing development aid provided by the Annex I party, and the CERs achieved by the CDM project must be in addition to those that would have occurred without the project. For this purpose, project baselines must be developed, which describe the most likely course of development and the situation that would have prevailed in the absence of the CDM project. A project methodology, including the baseline, must be approved for each project. Alternatively, an existing approved methodology can be adopted. A list of proposed and approved CDM methodologies can be found at the website of the UNFCCC. Step 1. A template for the CDM project design document, PDD, which the project participants must prepare to get CDM project approval, is available at the UNFCCC website. As of February 2014, a total of 7,445 CDM projects had been registered. Step 2. Once prepared, the PDD must be validated by an independent designated operational entity, DOE, which has been accredited by the EB that in practice will usually be a financial auditing firm. The PDD must then be sent for registration by the EB, together with confirmation from the host country that the project activity will assist in achieving sustainable development and that the host country voluntarily agrees to participate in the project. Step 3. The CDM project will then be able to proceed, during which it must be monitored by the project participants and independently reviewed from time to time. At the end of the CDM project, a DOE must certify the resultant CERs by subtracting the emissions achieved from the previously approved baseline emissions, subject to taking account of leakage. Step 4. Once the certified CERs are verified, they can be allocated on the basis agreed between the project participants and issued by the registry of the CDM to be offset against a country's emissions reduction target. Emission trading, ET. Article 17 of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol allows Annex B parties to participate in emissions trading internationally for the purpose of fulfilling their commitments under the protocol. Any such trading must be supplemental to domestic actions to reduce emissions. Annex B parties can thus transfer or require ERUs, CERs, AAUs, or removal units, RMUs, issued in accordance with relevant provisions as long as they meet specified eligibility requirements. National entities, individuals or companies can also participate in the trading of emission reduction units if authorized by a state party. Let's click on the Eligibility tab. To be eligible to participate in emissions trading, Annex B parties must fulfill several requirements. Its assigned amount must have been calculated and recorded. It must have a national system in place. It must also have a national registry in place, and it must be up to date with its reporting obligations concerning inventories and supplementary information. Each party is obliged to keep a reserve that cannot be traded under Article 17 of the Protocol, and should not be allowed to drop beyond 90% of its assigned amount. Any such trading must also be supplemental to domestic emission reduction programs. The option of international emissions trading became available in 2008, though action had already been taken to set up a trading system in the European Union. Land use change, and forestry. A sink stores atmospheric carbon in a carbon pool. Examples of carbon pools are forest biomass, wood products, and soils. The inclusion of carbon sinks in the 1997 Kyoto Protocol was very controversial. Article 3 of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol provides that parties must count both the sequestration, storage, and the emission of greenhouse gases from eligible land use change and forestry activities. Brackets LULUCF brackets in measuring performance towards their 1997 Kyoto Protocol targets. Only net changes from human-induced activities relating to afforestation, reforestation, or deforestation can be legitimately counted. Parties are required to account for the net changes on which they are relying in meeting their commitments, and must include emissions from land use change in the baseline used for calculating their assigned amounts. Some parties have wanted to include additional types of sinks, but it was agreed during negotiations on the 1997 Kyoto Protocol that this would have to be decided at a later stage. Credits. Further rules on LULUCF were agreed at COP7 in Marrakesh, where a new trading unit, a removal unit RMU, was created specifically for sink credits. It will be possible to convert RMUs into, for example, emission reduction units, ERUs. Nevertheless, the serial number of each ERU will include information about the LULUCF activity for which it was issued, and this identification will remain even when the RMU is converted into an ERU. General principles governing the validity of LULUCF activities were also formed at COP7 as follows. Assessment of LULUCF activities should be based on sound science. Consistent methodologies are to be used for estimating and reporting these activities. The mere presence of carbon stocks is to be excluded from accounting, as are increased removals due to faster growth caused by increasing concentrations of atmospheric CO2. Any reversals of LULUCF removals are to be accounted for at the appropriate time, and LULUCF activities must contribute to biodiversity conservation and the sustainable use of natural resources. On top of AAUs and RMUs, ERUs generated by a joint implementation project and CERs generated from a clean development mechanism project activity can also be traded in the carbon market. The Clean Development Mechanism is designed to encourage emission reduction projects that assist in achieving sustainable development in developing countries. Is that true or false? Well done. The Clean Development Mechanism is designed to encourage emission reduction projects that assist in achieving sustainable development in developing countries. Using this mechanism, an Annex 1 party can support the implementation of eligible projects in non-Annex 1 parties, leading to the generation of certified emission reductions, CERs. Let's continue. As intended by the Berlin Mandate, the commitments required by the Kyoto Protocol from Annex 1 parties cover the 5 greenhouse gases listed in Annex A and B, particular quantified emission reduction target, the 6 greenhouse gases listed in Annex A and each Annex 1 party's particular quantified emission reduction target listed in Annex B. Well done. These commitments cover the 6 greenhouse gases listed in Annex A of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride, and each Annex 1 party's particular quantified emission reduction target is listed in Annex B.